Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and a little out of my element, as I am an English professor. So I'm introducing quite a lot of poetry into this lecture. Poetry is a kind of visitor here, but hopefully it will help to illuminate some of the discussion of the paintings as well. What do we see when we look at the world? Does art bring us closer to reality, or does it establish its own reality? When we represent an object in space, how do we account for the fact that it exists in time? Is there a fourth dimension that relates objects to a unified immensity beyond the fragmented field of our own senses? And how do we render nature truthfully without annihilating the will or the agency of the perceiver? Modernists were obsessed with questions like these. So I begin with a little pedagogical study, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, a study of two pairs by American poet Wallace Stevens, who loved painting and loved thinking about painting. I told you I'd start with poetry to make myself feel at home. Study of two pairs. 1. Opusculum pedagogum. The pairs are not vials, nudes, or bottles. They resemble nothing else. 2. They are yellow forms composed of curves bulging toward the base. They are touched red. 3. They are not flat surfaces, having curved outlines. They are round, tapering toward the top. 4. In the way they are modeled, there are bits of blue. A hard, dry leaf hangs from the stem. 5. The yellow glistens. It glistens with various yellows, citrons, oranges, and greens flowering over the skin. 6. The shadows of the pairs are blobs on the green cloth. The pairs are not seen as the observer wills. Now, Stevens is capable of great poetic flourishes, but here he keeps the style very plain to suggest modernist reductions. Stevens' mind moves in a rhythm of negation and assertion, doubt and belief, as he attempts to grasp the object of perception. Resemblances are discovered and then discarded, not only in pursuit of a unified visual truth, but to acknowledge the manifold, the plurality contained within the narrow focus. For, of course, artists love pairs partly because they do resemble vials, nudes, and bottles, especially nudes. Seeing is forgetting the names of the things one sees. Stevens mentions pairs at the beginning and the end of the poem, but in between he asks us to see them as color and form, substance and shadow. He is not trying to paint with words, but he is trying to think like a painter, refining his idea of the visual world. We might read this poem as a little narrative about that process, a 6-step process in this case. Stevens might be trying to think, in fact, like Cézanne, an artist for whom, quoting Cézanne, painting nature is not copying the object, but realizing sensations. And realization is not transparency. So I have a little study of 3 pairs by Cézanne. 3 is very different from 2. You know, 2 has a certain balance. 3, to me, always suggests certain betweenness, especially in this case where you feel like the fallen pair has created that upside-down pear shape in between the other 2. Cézanne aimed at painting, quote, nature as it is seen and nature as it is felt, the nature that is there in the world and the nature that is here in the mind. His art is not about tricking the eye into believing it's somewhere else. It involves a reciprocity of world and mind, of the 2 pairs becoming one. I think that's part of what Stevens means by a study of 2 pairs. Painting pair, world pair. But the artist must not intervene with expressionistic distortions must not make nature simply speak for him, according to Cézanne. The artist, quote, must silence all the voices of prejudice within him. He must forget, and then the entire landscape, or in this case, still life, will engrave itself on the sensitive palette of his being. Now, we've all seen those deliciously busy and mirror-like still lifes, which pull the eye here and there over their descriptive surfaces. You're noting this incidental detail in that, so we've got a dewdrop here and a wormhole there and a skin blemish there, and it's very exciting, and eventually the attention flags. Cézanne looks, though, for underlying principles that will unify his perception. For him, as he said, nature is more of depths than of surfaces. And the poet, Walt Stevens, who must introduce features one by one in sequence, envies this compositional power of the artist. Stevens turns verbs into attributes to convey the idea of realization. So I'll just give you back the Stevens for a minute. The pairs are composed by nature and by art, touched red by the ripening season and by the artist's hand. You see the passive voice he uses. I love that he says touched red, too, because in visual experience, touch is deferred, but in talking about the skin of the pears, even though he's told us that they are not nudes, still we feel touch evoked. They are modeled impersonally, yet with deliberate seizing and composing of nature's truth for the mind. These pears glisten, and they don't glisten because there's a dewdrop on them. They glisten because they've been numinously and prismatically realized. So how still is still life? Still life paints objects at rest, but like a ripened fruit, a modern painting carries in it the memory of its processes. Stevens makes the analogy between fruit and painting when he mentions stem and leaf and says the fruity colors are flowering over the skin. As the poem turns from the objects to their shadows, blobs on the green cloth, he calls them, we reach the end of a labor of perception. Blobs reminds us of the pitched tension in modern art between form and formlessness. Green cloth, an ambiguity of nature and canvas. The work of art is its own consummation, in that the composition embodies that act of mind and the work of painting, and that has encountered the world. And many modern still lifes, I think, are kind of laboratories for this encounter. All right, so move to another study of two pairs. About a decade earlier than Stevens's poem, the young American painter George O'Keefe did a study of two pairs. This is a pretty early O'Keefe. She put less emphasis than Cézanne on brushstrokes, building up the image. But geometry is certainly featured in the overlapping circles and squares. Roundness is certainly a motif here, creating motion. And there's a great range in the modulation of colors, greater than Cézanne's image, certainly, lending more individuality to the pairs, despite their similar position. Her tipped and diagonal table alerts us at once to the picture plane and the negotiation between 3 and 2 dimensions. The mottled colors of the pairs has the aspect of freshly dripped paint. Nothing is less real than realism, O'Keefe wrote. Highly specific features only fragment and obscure the essence she seeks. Compare O'Keefe's pairs to this botanical drawing of a kind of prototype of pears with its prototypical skin blemishes, and we see how a prototype is different from the kind of essence that O'Keefe is after. Just to go back there. It is only by selection, elimination, by emphasis that we get at the real meaning of things, she wrote. In pursuit of elemental effects, O'Keefe edits out not just the textural detail, but the orchard, the harvest, the market, the scenes of preparation and consumption, most signs of human intervention. Hers are studio pears, pears to be studied once we forget what pears are for. They hang in a kind of void, newly picked for the eye and for the mind. Any heat aroused in O'Keefe's red pears is cooled by the orbiting shadows and the white background, their glow from an undisclosed light source presented for visual contemplation, displacing other appetites. These two pears, like Stevens's, are, quote, bulging at the base and, quote, tapering at the top, not mere flat surfaces having curved outlines, though we are aware of the artist's hand in bringing sculptural feeling into flat form. They are touched red so that their forms are thrust forward even as the bits of blue or black shadows give depth to the modeling. These pears are not just green or red or yellow. They are, as in Stevens, citrons, oranges, and greens, seeming to evoke other fruit even as they are distinctly pears. While these pears may be intuited in the mind, they retain a degree of individuality. One pear might be a prototype, a paragon. Two pears ask for comparison. Even in a search for essences, no two pears are alike. In contrast to the products of machines, cans of soup, for instance, which would later be the subject of still life. O'Keefe reveres nature and reminds us we are looking at art. The shadows here are decoupled from the solid forms in space, becoming properties of the composition. So, just silence that for a minute. So why do painters love fruit? Is it the desire to preserve and elevate for art a reality that by its nature is ephemeral and everyday? Or perhaps it is because fruit as an object which activates our senses stands in, whether symbolically or by example, for our desire toward the earth, scaled to the hand, and the transactions between nature and man. Perhaps it even stands for art, understood as an organic process. After all, fruit is nature's art. Still life exists in a continuum, of course, and the motivations vary, but more often than not, still life draws attention to its artifice, to its setup, designed for pleasure in display and for the exploration of form or for the symbolic potential of its objects. Still life may be a way to explore one's appetites, one's passions and longings, but indirectly in a removed space. Yeah. Marston Hartley also studied pears, another study of two pears, and in his changing treatment of them, we can see some of the evolution of his evolution as an artist. Hartley started out as a mood-evoking impressionist, but he was always reading and talking about the aims of art and changing his work as he encountered new ideas. At Alfred Stieglitz's studio, he met Max Weber and other artists painting in the tradition of Cézanne and Matisse, and he soon set to work applying the lessons of the masters. Barbara Haskell, a Hartley scholar, quotes his letter to Stieglitz, in which he writes that he has, quote, but one ambition, to put down with the sense of authority and artistic conviction an object, some days for form alone, then for color. And so it is good to get at this problem of expressing the impersonal, things without mood, things existing for themselves only as shapes, forms with color. So Barbara Haskell has a number of examples of this phase of Hartley's career, and this is one that she's chosen to represent it, Still Life 11 of 1911. The painting gives us a strong sense of the mind actively grasping and unifying what it sees, though through the essentials of color and form, rather than passively recording disparate sensations. We recognize Cézanne in the strong brushwork as Hartley builds up the image out of strokes of color, long ones here compared to the staccato of Cézanne, to stress the perpendicular composition and the vigorous sense of geometry in the work. The triangular frame of the drapery literally staging the triangular pears, the plate suggesting their roundness. The bidirectional pull of the composition is centered in the alternate positions of the fruit. The treatment is forceful, theatrical even, but there's nothing particularly personal about it. But we do not remember Hartley primarily for his impersonal rendering of reality. Quite the opposite. His turbulent, mystical nature would reassert itself fairly quickly in both his poetry and his painting. His art communicated not only the provocations of nature, but also those of the inner life, his sensibility, even his personal experience. Hartley had read Kandinsky's Concerning the Spiritual in Art, a widely translated theoretical work that impacted both artists and writers well beyond the influence of Kandinsky's paintings. Kandinsky emphasized what he called inner necessity, a counterpressure of emotion and thought awakened in an act of perception, so that the visible field becomes a composition embodying not just the rational, but the spiritual energy of man. And if you've seen the Still Life show, the Art and Appetite show, you probably recognize this one. Fauvism, associated with Matisse and its later developments, projected this inner necessity through its tremendous freedoms of line and color, informed not so much by the analytical eye as by the intuiting imagination. We see the dialectic of impersonal analysis and inner necessity here in this Still Life number 3. Here again we have a study of pairs in which pairs are featured. They're not isolated. They are part of a composition that includes a riot of shapes and colors afforded by the variety of fruits, round green apples, oblong lemons. But the color here is not just an attribute of the objects. It's a primary compositional force that's very expressive and dramatic. The composition is boldly unified also by the receding triangular frames that may suggest a table, floor, and walls, but for me at least also seem to arch over the image, those very bold, that black and red. The mixture of natural and man-made objects creates a further play between container and contained. We take note of Cézanne's influence in the tipped table with its seemingly floating pitcher, the competition of front and back, and the spilled fruit that creates dialogue between form and formlessness. The pairs are presented as shapes in a rhythm of shapes more than things within the contingencies of nature. In contrast to the relative poise of O'Keefe's composition, we are aware here of a struggle to contain an overflow, darting from what is outside and what is inside, creating tensions between vertical and horizontal orientations. This very tension lends energy to objects at rest as they seem to lean and roll in or away from each other. The poet Howard Nemeroff, and I told you I'd be bringing poetry in when I can, in a playful mood, wrote about modern still life. He's a much later writer, but looking at still lifes, he wrote about, quote, a slight migraine of form, holding together every side against the old atomic storm. He's probably looking at Cubist works, something of Braque or Gris, which this is certainly not a Cubist work, yet his poem seems to suit this painting when he says, to continue, quote, these things upon the tilted table grow tense with only standing still, while shadows patched of slate and sable seek to make all matter spill. The formal white bowl cannot contain the heat and energy of the cruder objects. The free and bold use of color, too, gives the work an emotional character. And Hartley's experiences would soon push him more strongly in the direction of animating still life with his inner necessity. Although he spent a great deal of time in Maine, where he was raised, in New York City, where Stieglitz showed his work for many years, and in Europe, where he was for a time part of the Gertrude Stein Circle, Hartley was a nomad, and the search for cheap housing and healing climate took him at one point to Bermuda. A hotel room with a narrow window looking out into the sea now replaces the closed studio space. Again, we see him exercising his passion upon a study of two pairs. But there's little question about the erotic character of the pairs in A Bermuda Window in Semi-Tropic Character of 1917. Now the world given by the senses is infused with the artist's desires, and not for fruit alone. As the art critic Paul Rosenfeld, a contemporary of Hartley's and close to the Stieglitz circle, remarked, quote, "A cold and ferocious sensuality seeks to satisfy itself in Hartley's still lifes, with their heavy, still gold bananas, their dark, luscious figs, their erectile pears." I suppose Rosenfeld means unsentimental and direct when he says cold. But in this image, at least, there is a holiday spirit of frank and awakened sexuality. I don't find this cold at all. Stevens, in his study of two pairs, may evoke the nude in order to cancel it. Hartley makes certain we see it. These pairs and even the pear-shaped clouds, you see the echo there of the objects at the top and bottom of the picture, express sexual appetite, though anatomically ambiguous. The dark curtain bands that frame the window allow the thrust of the viewer with the elongated vase and flower into the scene. Rich and pleasing as the colors and forms are, this work is not so much decorative or formal as expressive. Here, certainly the artist intervenes, as Cézanne would not. But while Hartley found a way to engage and register personal emotion in still life through symbolism and style, he gives an iconic dimension to local events, so he enlarges them. They're not only about him. And I think Banquet in Silence, which is also from the Art and Appetite show, is such a painting. The concerns of Cézanne have little sway here, at least as I see it. Even without the suggestive title, a mood of mourning and melancholia. This is called Banquet in Silence, or Silent Banquet. Banquet in Silence, yes. A mood of mourning and melancholia resonates from the iconic image, its objects, treatment, and palette. There is little dialogue with natural space. Hartley asks us to enter into a kind of reverie here, though the painting can be experienced at many levels. Earth, sea, and sky are all present in this banquet. So it has that in common with those lavish displays of Dutch lobsters and so on. But it presents an image of simplicity and poverty. It's a kind of vanitas, even, where the transience of life is emphasized. Although it's not without its pleasure in display. All of us can connect immediately to the strange mixture of ghostliness and festivity in the painting, and the sense that the silence of this banquet may connote not only the inherent muteness of the visual image, the fish open-mouthed yet speechless, but the solemnity of a funeral wake. Fish are symbols of mortal life, and because they have eyes, they can be connected to the human, I think, much more than pears. And they figure prominently in Christian tradition, where they are associated with spiritual power. Actually, it would be interesting to compare this to the paintings by Chase in the exhibit of fish, because the eyes aren't featured nearly as much there. They're limp objects. Christ's apostles were fishermen. The number 3 also introduces religious symbolism. The story of the loaves and the fishes and the Last Supper hover around this image, though not in any doctrinal way. Hartley had developed many private symbols during his career, but in this painting he found a way to unite his personal interests with a long iconographic tradition. This painting was made in response to events that occurred in 1936 while he was boarding with the Mason family on a remote island in Nova Scotia. The Masons were simple folk who warmly welcomed Hartley into their home. He was moved by their decency and unaffected Christian piety. Quote, "There is a touch of Christian martyrdom about the life anyhow, for they endure such hardships and hate any show of cheap affectation. All this vitality and vital energy and force, I have never been so near the real thing before." Hartley became erotically and emotionally attached to one of the mason's grown sons, Alty, whom Hartley painted several times, often with his signature rose in his ear. Alty, along with his brother and an adolescent cousin, drowned in the storm on their return from the mainland. Hartley remembers the drowning in this painting of three fishes, I can't document that he has them in mind, but the proximity of the dates certainly suggests it. Alty's signature rose surrounds the fish to add the decorative feature to the somber image. The roses also perhaps recall the tradition of maritime communities of throwing wreaths out to sea to bless the sailors or to commemorate those lost at sea. The blue background suggests at once the sea and a spiritual sky to which the drowned youths ascend. If the whiteness of the fish makes them ghostly, their eyes are otherworldly, and yet the handling of the paint, thickly applied on the fish, and at moments it even seems to coincide with where the scales would be, it resists the pull toward abstraction. And this is also in the, well, actually, this is an early version of the painting that is in the show. This is another painting of the same subject. In this painting, Fisherman's Last Supper, we have a much more explicit image of association with Christianity, especially in the first one, that the words mene, mene come from a Bible quotation, and they basically mean your days are numbered. Here we have the circumstances of the family, the context marked on the ship in the turbulent waves. The sons are present here, but you have empty chairs, and the stars over their heads suggest that they are ill-starred. The wreaths seem to commemorate their absence already. And here we get the stars have disappeared and become kind of vaguely halo-like feelings. This second rendering also strikes me as very emotionally involved, in that the turbulence of the storm is felt even in the way the table is slightly tipped, as if they're inside a ship even. Something quite unstable about it, even though the figures themselves have tremendous stability. Well, Fisherman's Last Supper reminds us that the table isn't just a platform for visual analysis, nor is it just an altar for sacramental pictorialism. It's also a place of daily rituals, a place where nature meets culture. And so I'm going to move on to a very different kind of painter now. Food preparation and consumption is loaded with social meaning. So for Hartley in that last painting, there's spiritual meaning, here very much social meaning. Thus, fraught matters of gender, of class, of regional identity, of modernization and urbanization, all parts of our human reality, find their way into still life, the poetry of the everyday. This is a painting by Peter Bloom, and it explores many of these charged concerns. It's called Vegetable Dinner. Apparently he was a vegetarian for a time. It's full of subtle negotiations between modernity and tradition, even though it's starring very homely squash and carrots. When I first saw this painting, I thought of another painting by Velázquez, and I'm not really sure why, except that Velázquez's painting, it's called Christ in the House of Mary and Martha. And so it's based on a biblical parable, and yet right smack in very large in the middle of the painting, in the foreground, is a fish and an egg, as if he's to say, still life is what it's about. And but all the energy of the parable finds its way into the objects. And here again, you've got upstage the most humble objects, but there's a story going on in the margins that's very much involved with the objects. So the setting is given to us by the window that's kind of hacked out in the corner there. The setting is Gloucester Harbor, and it's a somewhat stormy place, suggesting a kind of mood for the painting as well as for giving context. And the interior cropping interests me especially here in connection with still life, because it's as if he's taken still life and then just moved the frame out a little bit so that what's usually cropped out of still life is now let in, but not completely. So that, you know, as I said, you know, in the OKeefe you have studio pears. Here you could easily have studio squashes and carrots, but no, you have them in a table space that's domestic. And the objects are flanked by two women, only partially seen, doing everyday activity of conversing. One prepares a meal. But the woman in the orange machine print dress with her jazz-age hairstyle and her idle hands hardly seems to fit this regional context. She's probably up from New York. The faceless figure in the plain red seems better suited to the modest setting. Her hands are involved in manual labor. They're not idle like the other woman. The vegetables are rendered with an elemental figurative truth, such as we see in OKeefe sometimes. But Bloom is also learning his lessons of Cubism and breaking with illusion and representing angled geometric forms that abstract other parts of the image. So there's a tension in this heterogeneous style, a tension that carries over into the two female figures, perhaps representing the artist's confusion about his art as much as about his partner, and the same woman modeled for both figures. On the one hand, modern, aesthetic, and urban, and on the other hand, traditional and practical and local. So still life generally is not a narrative art, and this isn't a narrative painting, but to me, it does, in a way, suggest a tableau for a short story, or at least I would love to see someone write a short story based on this painting. So that while the objects are in the focus, they do kind of absorb the drama, I think. Their handling isn't expressionistic, but you can't help but see in these patty pan squashes and these fat carrots certain erotic objects. There's something pelvic and petticoated and breast-like about the squashes, and certainly something phallic about the carrots, so that we have a sense of what this conversation is about. Peter Bloom was one of many artists of the 20s who had been working in the metropolis, but who retreated temporarily to rural communities, not just for the quiet and cost efficiency, but for the essential feeling that they associated with this life. In their work, they often used modernist strategies to resist or critique modernity, or at least to resist the heavy interventions of technology and the social complexity of urban life. They sought to rediscover nature in the world and in themselves, and used the new freedoms of a modern style as a way to evoke a strong spiritual and emotional connection to organic life through a return to elemental forms and experiences. OKeefe and Hartley may be considered in this way. But another group of artists embraced, however ironically and ambivalently at times, the noise, the jazz, the artifice, the hype, and the machinery of the modern scene. And this is not a still life, obviously, but I'll explain why I have it here. Still life is such a flexible genre that it can accommodate both sensibilities, the urban and the more elemental. However, these new concerns, that is, with artifice and with machinery and with commercial landscape, also challenge the boundaries of still life, especially the divide between the public and domestic worlds, between word and image, and between art and commerce. The industrial precisions and the commercial vitality of the 20s had transformed the visual field, and this inspired not only new subject matter, but also aesthetic invention. Art presses back against the pressures of new realities, often by transfiguring and appropriating what challenges it. And I think we will see more and more of this as we move in through the 20th century. Stuart Davis, Charles Dameth, Gerald Murphy, among other Americans, developed new artistic styles in dialogue with new promotional graphics on the street and in the home, graphics that increasingly included words and images on the same plane. And that's why I have this image here by Charles Dameth called Buildings, Lancaster. It mixes agricultural and industrial, office and plant, right? And it also plays with our efforts to read the visual field. He adds to the cubist enigma of 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions, the new commercial puzzle of billboards in illusionary space. It is 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. Dameth's friend, the poet William Carlos Williams, was himself profoundly influenced by artists of the Stieglitz Circle and wrote many poems inspired by their work. And so in this poem, as in the Dameth's picture that we just looked at, there's this mixing of word and image, which is a kind of new challenge for artists. The attic, which is desire, the unused tent of bare beams beyond which directly wait the night and day. Here from the street by soda, ringed with running lights, the darkened pane exactly down the center is transfixed. Williams here conflates verbal and visual signs when he presents a neon-studded ad from the street. So he's in his attic, his garret, his romantic poet's garret, looking out on the street and, you know, into the night, and what does he see? Soda, right, in the neon. Read vertically instead of from left to right across an attic window pane, kind of a cross figure. Word and image operate according to different sign systems, but this poem mixes them up. Is soda a word or an image? The asterisks depict the lights of the sign and perhaps suggest the bubbles of the soda itself. And as for bubbles, so the poet presents himself as a romantic in his garret, the attic, which is desire. But is this elixir of the everyday world of, you know, modern life a source of inspiration or a shallow unreality that will soon go flat? What is the result when contemplation meets commerce? And then many of the artists in the later part of Art and Appetite are certainly asking that question. By the 30s, Stuart Davis, another friend of William Carlos Williams, was building verbal advertising signage and wordplay into his compositions. Still life has often been a threshold space where the outer world of nature, of the market, of social organization comes into the more intimate space of the home. But Davis was working in an urban environment where eating out was common, and thus his street scenes and his still lifes tend to overlap, collapsing distinctions of scale. This one is coffee pot. In coffee pots, transience and mobility, not stasis and domesticity, as traditional in still life, prevail. Scenes are, so I think one of the things he is doing here is sort of taking the coffee beans and spilling them all over the painting. Coffee is not served at home, but at a street cafe around the corner from a hotel. Word becomes image in the various styles, fonts, and sizes of the signs, read horizontally, vertically, diagonally, some curved, some rectangular, P's and S's and O's like round pots against the square and rectangular urban forms, the more rectangular coffee pots maybe in the windows, repeated in the H's and L's and E's. Davis had a playful side, always, I think, and we can see it in full operation in Super Table, which is in which is in the show, which I think probably puns on supper table. This marvelous Prohibition-era invention is, for me, because I think anybody can stand in front of it and start to play with it. For me, it's a sewing machine, an artist's workplace, a sidebar for mixing cocktails, an oven for cooking up new ideas, and so on. Depending on what we want to see in it, it's a table with an open top, or it's a mirror or a window looking out on a brick wall. That's as many windows in urban spaces do. It's a kind of meta painting, linking the conventions of illusionary art and modernism's critique of it, because sort of mirror and window are themes of illusionary art. Cubism's hard-edged shapes have gone a bit woozy from the champagne. The trapezoids and grids are curvy, suggesting a haze of smoke or just a drunken gaze. And there's an earlier image that he used in many works, actually, a kind of Picasso-like figure in miniature there. The curves, to me, also suggest a nude, and so this has the look of maybe of an invitation to a gentleman's club. Could also be an art catalog. But the wine glass or the champagne glass next to it sure does look a little bit like a whiskered gentleman who might have been at this gentleman's club. So he's more than a little in his cups, I think. So these miniatures make the table a stage, and the drapery has the sparkles and bubbles of the nightclub mood still on it. Just briefly, another drunken gaze, I guess you could say, although very hard-edged this time. Something very Cole Porter about this painting to me, and also very masculine, I think, with the cigars and so on. But it's, I think he shares Stuart Davis's fascination with modern leisure and also with machine aesthetic and with commercial graphics. This seems to me, again, a little bit like a stage, the stairs in those grand Broadway shows, but also has the effect of assembly line, kind of celebration of machine art. The most naturalistic thing in the image is the Cigar Box label, which with its old world symbols. So it's a kind of mixed aesthetic in a collage style here. Okay, so this work of Davis's, of Murphy's, is certainly a celebration, I think, of modern leisure and urban life. So we skip ahead a little bit now. After World War II, where we get an increase in consumer culture, the raw was not just cooked, but processed, packaged, frozen, refrigerated, priced as a commodity, and thoroughly denatured. Food culture in America, just going to put this just for a minute. Food culture in America was part of commercial culture, focused on new values of convenience, efficiency, speed, uniformity, impersonality, and economy. And with these developments came a new poetics of display, for which the supermarket, more than the table, was a master trope. Stuart Davis, perhaps the least nostalgic of painters in American modernism, continued to embrace these changes as incitements to art and formal invention. So, what happened here? Okay, there we go. In 1956, well before pop art, Fortune magazine invited Davis to devise an artwork from products found in a supermarket. So here I get word and image together. This is called Premiere, and I think it has allusions to the stage, maybe, as well as to quality assurance. It draws directly from the labels he found for Hunt's catsup and Brillo pads, connecting their words by cropping them to jazz rhythms and lingo to make something new and hardly still. So again, we see the artist doesn't just mirror the world we live in, he gives it back to us as an aesthetic idea, provoking formal and social reflection. Here, we might say, is still life without objects. Words loosed from context and arranged vertically or upside down invite us to create a new syntax, a new geometry of language. So we have cat from catsup, but also suggesting cool cat, especially when you have pad from Brillo pad, cool cat in his pad, and we have bag next to cat. There's also the cat footprints there down at the bottom. When you have cat and bag next to each other, of course, you put the catsup in the bag, but you can put a cat in the bag too. So he's having a lot of fun here. What happens to the senses when words replace things? Because words don't occur in nature. Shapes and colors here recall coffee pots of 25 years earlier, but the streets have become grocery aisles stocked with anagrams. Not everyone saw the changes in America as prompts for creative invention, of course. In 1950, David Reisman, in The Lonely Crowd, lamented the new conformity in America that paradoxically left man isolated as he lost sensual and emotional contact with the world. The supermarket might represent a new dynamic visual field or serve as an emblem of our commodity-saturated life and for the way life had become soulless and unreal. For the poet Allen Ginsberg in 1957, it might be a bit of both. And I'm going to read you just a little bit of a supermarket in California. He imagines the ghost of Walt Whitman, who lived in a very different America, an America of farms and farmers' markets. But Whitman always spoke to the future, haunted it with his direct address. If Whitman is Virgil to Ginsberg's Dante, is modern life a limbo? If so, the poet makes the most of it. He's certainly not writing like T.S. Eliot of a colorless wasteland. So here's the beginning of the poem. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walked down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras, what families shopping at night. Aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes. And you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking questions of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans, following you and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing each frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Whenever I come to that phrase, the frozen delicacy, I think of these wonderful still lifes that Irving Penn made of frozen food. They're very beautiful. So our impression may at first be a negative one. Some people see the poem that way, how far we've come in 100 years from the optimistic embrace of the crowd that Whitman gave us. But maybe the America of love was always an artist's dream more than a social reality. And why shouldn't the supermarket be a place for dreaming or neon a medium for artistic delight? The poem is a kind of dark comedy in which neon modifies not only the supermarket but the fruit, and people are on display as much as the products. Whitman's emphasis on touch, smell, sight, and on the diurnal cycles of nature must contend with modern packaging and pricing, light and lighting, artificial lighting. But the pumped-up colors create a surreal vigor worthy of the Spanish poet Garcia Lorca, another outsider. The artist may be a trespasser in the supermarket in California, arousing the suspicions of the store detective. But his imaginary possession, tasting the artichokes, possessing each frozen delicacy, wrests reality from commodification and other forces that would dull it. Ginsberg is prophetic when he says the stacks of cans lit by the fluorescent night light of the store are, after all, brilliant. So, and I'll close with a little bit about the art of the 60s and 70s, a couple of examples. Pop art and photorealism. They took the question of the unreal real, the way the inventions of the mechanical reproduction and commodity capitalism transformed our world and removed us from manual labor, even from food preparation. and from a sensual and emotional experience. Spectacle and simulacra are the key words of postmodernism. But there's a tonal ambivalence, and it's quite a range, too, I think, in the kind of irony that they create. Start with Roy Lichtenstein. This is in your show. His use of newsprint graphics reinforces the ambivalence as the world dissolves not only into, not so much now into cubist cylinders and cones, but into pixel dots and stenciled shapes. And I look at this standing rib and I want to say, who killed the pork chops? Or more to the point, who made the image? The work of art, like the labor of food processing, seems to be eliminated. But some photorealist work put the here and now of painting back into the photographic record. Richard Estes' supermarket image captures many of the enigmas of the real from a different angle. It answers photography by incorporating it, but he commandeers photography for his own purposes. I noted, by the way, that there's a photorealist show going on in, at Yale Art Gallery, and it's called Still Life. Means something different, of course. There's something, again, I think metapictorial about this. Art's mirror and window are now one, and looking out and looking in seem to be collapsing together. Enfolding with this gesture all the threshold concepts of modern life, where the outside presses in on the inside. So the cars are reflected on the glass, and the grocery aisles are echoing in the street. Estes has a remarkable sense of color, I think, and it's quite distinct from the quality of color photography. It seems both compositional and also thematic. For instance, the roasts are advertised in a blue. That's a blue that we seldom see in nature, but we do see it stamped with AFD seals on our meat and other products. The cans set up in the shallow display space against a pastel green backdrop have never seen the grass, and the crop numbers and words dominate over the things. There's something affectless in the scene. Prices are huge and people are faceless. The numbers and letters linked to the fluorescent lines almost seem like thought bubbles, like cartoon thought bubbles. And yet the painting is full of interest and engages us in a very immediate way as viewers. We see how he's built this brilliantly in its reversals and inversions and threaded it with the red color and microactivity. Nothing is less real than realism, said OKeefe, but when the real becomes unreal, a flat photorealism becomes a new ground for art's pursuit of the actual. Just a couple more images. And what of the spiritual? When Andy Warhol renders the silk screen Campbell's soup can in the colors of dream life, what is he telling us? What peaches and what penumbras, exults Ginsberg as he ranges through the neon fruit supermarket. But what is left of appetite, let alone of spirit, in this image? Has our American dream been condensed to utter flatness and pseudo-spirituality of the commodity fetish? Well, I think Warhol, too, is taking it back. He seems to challenge art's exclusion, certainly, celebrating the synthetic and the mass-produced and mass culture and bringing them center stage with Campbell's tomato soup. Yet the fleur-de-lis of the label and the unfamiliar colorings give the object a touch of the uncanny. For all the interest in mass production, Warhol introduces slight variation through error and alteration in each of his repetitions of Campbell's soup. He made a great many of them. There's one, I think, with like 32, but each one actually is just a little bit different. So actually, no two cans are alike. But the death of painting was greatly exaggerated, and it has continued an energetic restoration of the senses and the spirit. And I'll conclude with this image. Wayne Thiebaud paints a consumer's world of countless pies and cakes and other foods displayed in luncheonettes, bakery windows, and other public domains. This is certainly not a return to the primitive of nature, to the raw. These are not pears. Though these are these scenes evoke those familiar settings, they're abstracted, bringing a kind of fictional quality to the space that also makes the scale of it rather ambiguous, I think. Though they seem to call up a very public spaces, there's something very intimate that happens in the rendering of these images. As many people have noted, the thickly applied paint in Thiebaud's work stands in for the frosting. So, you know, just as you can't touch paintings, your mother told you not to lick the frosting off the cake, right? But you want to. And it extends our desire from the object to the canvas, even as these objects enter this long chorus line of the cafeteria. And he does make us see each one by one. You know, each of these girls in the chorus line is different, even though they may look alike or wear the same costumes. These are not cookie cutter. They've been individually cut. One of the things I've been struck by in thinking about this, this show is that blue is it's a color that is associated with dream life and shadow. And it seems to play a large part in these works of the unreal real, more than in most still life. Blue has a very powerful allure. And if Thiebaud draws on the expressive power of color, he also evokes Cubism's preoccupation with geometry. But now the world comes already broken down into circles and wedges. So, you know, Cézanne took nature and turned it into cylinders and cones, but it's already been done for us here. And what this does, I think, so movingly for me, is that Thiebaud then creates a kind of humble alliance with the sandwich maker and the cake slicer in their companionable impulse to form and to arrange and to display. Thank you.